Hello, I'm Layne Hartsell, and I'm here with Lierre and Derrick Jensen, two eco-philosophers that I've followed for many years. And I look forward to talking to you about techniques and civilization today. Hello, how are you?
Oh, thank you for having us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Yeah. This term, techniques and civilization, is important concerning the framework that we have in, say, Western civilization, particularly. And Derrick, you've written about this in numerous books. And can you talk about briefly the history going back, way back, and how this orientation about the world comes about for us?
Sure, it's a great question. And I think there's two approaches I want to take to it. One of them is, do people ever wonder how it is that cities end up being designed not so much for human beings, but for cars or trains or buses, ports, and how it seems that, I used to ask people when I would do talks if they believe that governments take better care of human beings or corporations. And everybody would laugh. And they would say, oh, of course it takes better care of corporations. And corporations are legal fictions. They don't really exist. So how weird is it to have a system that takes better care of these legal fictions than of human beings, never mind the natural world? And part of my understanding on how and why that's the case came through reading Lewis Mumford. And Lewis Mumford was a pro-technology philosopher who had his mind changed by World War II. And then for the rest of his career, he was completely brilliant. And in the early 60s, he wrote this great essay. I never can remember what it's called, Authoritarian Democratic Techniques or Democratic and Authoritarian Techniques.
Yes.
Okay.
It's alphabetical.
Alphabetical. Now I can remember it. Okay. So anyway, and in there, he talks about how a technics, Technic, is that technologies don't arise in a vacuum, and they emerge from certain social structures, and they give rise to certain social structures. And that can sound really confusing until you think about, for example, if you have mining, then that means you're going to have an army in order to conquer the land because somebody else lives there. And then once you have conquered the land, you're going to have a system of enforcement to get slaves to work in the mines because nobody wants to work underground all day. And then once you have that system of slaves, once you have the metals pulled from the ground and refined, you have to have a police force in order to keep people from stealing them. And so all of those are required in order to have a mine. And a great example of this is I was being interviewed by somebody many, many years ago. And he was a dedicated Marxist who believed that you could have a global economy, including cities, an industrial economy in which no one was exploited and all voluntary exchanges were, all economic exchanges were voluntary. And I said, great. How do you get around in your city? He said, buses. I said, what are the buses made of? He said, metal. I said, great. Where did the metal come from? He said, mines. I said, great. How did you get people to work in the mines? He said, well, you pay them a lot. I said, well, mining is such a horrible existence that the first miners it's one of the first forms of slavery. But I'm going to give this one to you. I said, what do you do with the fact that every hard rock mine in the world pollutes groundwater and pollutes rivers? And he said, well, you pay the people to leave. I said, what if they won't? He said, well, you pay them more. I said, well, what if they have lived there for 5,000 years, their ancestors are buried there, and they will not leave? He said, how many are there? I said, what difference does it make? It was 500, I don't know. He said, well, the 1 million people in the city vote, and they vote that those 500 people have to leave, and then you kick them off. And I said, oh, so you've gone from purely voluntary exchanges to democratic empire, land theft from indigenous people, and possibly genocide. Also, you can have a bus. And the point is that those technologies create the social structures. And so that's something, and I want to say one more thing, and then I'm going to throw it off to you. And the last thing I want to say is people often ask me, what do I think is the most important human invention for civilization? And I always respond, following Mumford again, that it's not the screw, it's not the lever, it's not gunpowder, it's not
The wheel.
the wheel. It is what he called the mega machine. And what that is a social organization consisting of humans put in and out as replaceable parts. And one of the first mega machines built the pyramids. How do you create a group of people large enough that you can accomplish these great tasks? And part of that has to do with humans we're fundamentally contentious. I mean, we get along, but we also can pick at each other. And there's this thing, Dunbar's number, which is about 120 or maybe 150, which is the largest number of people you can have in a group where you can know all the relationships. So we evolved in these small groups. How do you get 1 million people? I mean, anybody who's ever worked in a nonprofit or anybody who's ever been in an academic department knows that if you get 10 people together, they're going to start sniping at each other. They're going to, frankly, be jerks to each other. Somebody's going to be a jerk. And how do you get 1 million people to build a pyramid? Or how do you get 1 million people to invade Russia? Or how do you get 1 million people to sell Coca-Cola? Or how do you get 1 million people? It doesn't matter whether you're making trains run on time or sending trains to death camps. It doesn't matter. That what you have, this organization, the corporation, really, the top-down, bureaucratic, military-style organization has enabled people to get past their differences and to have 1 million people working together to sell Coca-Cola. And it's an extraordinary accomplishment, and it's killing the world. Anyway, so I'm going to throw it off to you now.
Well, and the reason that Mumford called that article Authoritarian and Democratic Techniques was he was making a distinction. And part of the reason is that we have this sort of fundamentalist belief that I don't think most of us really think about, but it's usually stated as technology is neutral. It just depends how we use it. And his article is really the best rejoinder to that I've ever read, because he's quite clear that some technologies, they require hierarchies to make them, and then they also make more of the same. So, and that's why he called it, he made up this new word, a technic, because it's both the technology and the social forces, the human forces around it. So it's like a whole suite, that sort of comes together and makes this thing called a technic, which changes the culture profoundly, and then also makes these physical things, these implements and then these structures happen. And he contrasts that with democratic techniques, which don't have that. Like, they don't have those properties. They don't require hierarchies, and they don't require, destroying your land base. And so they don't require a military. They don't require an army. They don't require, a general and a king and a priest and all this. It just, anybody can learn them, and you can't take it away from people either. So some really great examples would be passive solar. Like, my house is passive solar, and anybody can learn in any climate how to capture the sun using not much else besides mass, wood, so a little bit of glass, and you can have a solar house. And you can learn that in a weekend, and then you can build your own. And around the world, most people still live in, quote, mud huts. Most people live in houses made of mud. It's a really great building material in many climates, and anybody can do it. So these are the kinds of technologies that humans have developed and made really beautiful things out of.
Honeybees use passive solar.
Absolutely. And most animals, in fact, have this well figured out. There's no builders in nature, squares or rectangles. They all use circles, because it's the most amount of square footage for the least amount of envelope. For the perimeter of it, and a circle is perfect for that. And so that's why nests are circular and beehives are circular, and beaver dams are mostly circular. So they've got this figured out. And many animals, of course, do the same thing. They, the opening is toward the sun. so that they can capture the solar rays. So just one example, but there's many.
Mhm.
So that's why he made that distinction, even in the title of the article, to say that it's not all technology, it's a certain kind of technology. And we really do need to understand the properties of this, because we're destroying ourselves, but we're also destroying the planet.
That's right. This kind of, it sounds to me like there's this kind of technological imperative. We always resort to technology rather than, say, social structure, like the bees or something like they might do. Uh, Derrick, you talk about, say, the Epic of Gilgamesh. So going right back to the beginning, can you just say a few words about the literature and what we see, and then we'll move up to today and look at, what we're looking at today. Young people protesting and so forth, and yeah, the contentious.
Well, they say that one sign of intelligence is the ability to recognize patterns. And I'm going to lay out a pattern and let's see if we can recognize it in less than 6,000 years. And the pattern is, when you think of Iraq, is the first thing you think of cedar forest so thick that sunlight never touches the ground. Iraq was heavily forested, and the first written myth, or one of the first written myths of Western civilization, is Gilgamesh cutting down those trees to make a great city. And that's the entire story of civilization right there. And the Near East, or the Arabian Peninsula, was oak savanna. And the Near East was heavily forested. We've all heard of the cedars of Lebanon. They still have one on their flag.
On the flag.
The ancient Greeks were, was it Plato?
All three of them.
Oh,
Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle.
All complained that deforestation was harming water quality in ancient Greece. The ancient Greek islands, the Mediterranean islands, are not supposed to be bare rock like we see them now. They were, prior to this culture, the rocks were underground where they're supposed to be, and they were covered with trees. And North Africa was heavily forested, and the forests of North Africa went down to provide the Egyptian and Phoenician navies. And this is a pattern. Why are there no penguins in the Northern Hemisphere? There was an ecological equivalent of the penguin, which was the great auk, and they were as far south as France, and the last one was killed in the 19th century. That what this culture does is forests precede us and deserts dog our heels, because we convert the land base into humans. We convert the land base, we convert the entire productivity of the land base toward human use to make a city, to make cities, to make civilization, to make a military. And that is, one of the lines you always say is that that's not a plan with a future. And that's also something John Osborne says all the time. It's not a plan with a future. Well, it is a plan with a short future.
A very short-term future.
But it does have a short future.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that happens is, if you have two neighboring peoples and one of them converts their land base to weapons of war, to chariots, to, doesn't matter whether they're chariots or B-1 bombers, same process, and the other one does not, then this one will have a competitive advantage and will be able to take over this one. But unfortunately, then they destroy this land base, and they've got to expand again and again and again until they discover that, as you like to say, the earth is a bounded sphere. And
there's no more.
And there's no more. But in the meantime, they will have a competitive advantage, and it creates a world-class problem. I'm going to dump it off to you.
Well, we haven't defined civilization, so I'm going to do that now. So Derrick and I both define civilization as a way of life based on cities. And that is etymologically what it means. And a lot of people would define it the same way. We're not like making this up. We're not like new and brilliant. That's, generally what it means. But what that actually means is that the people who live there, they need more than the land can provide. So if you think about a city, what's there? Well, it's just buildings and roads. There's no way to get food, right? So all the things those people need, food, water, energy, whatever it is, it's got to come from somewhere else. So from that point forward, those people, it doesn't matter what beautiful, nonviolent, lovely spiritual values they might hold as a culture. It doesn't matter. They're dependent on imperialism and genocide, because no one willingly gives up their land, their water, their trees, their fish. but because the city has used it on its own, they have to go out and get it from somewhere else. And that is literally the history of the last 8,000 years. You have this power center, this giant city that's surrounded by conquered colonies. And then when they use up all that stuff, one of two things happens. It either collapses or it figures out how to expand a little bit more, and then it'll take some more colonies. Eventually, across history, it had kind of a natural endpoint. Cities could only get so big, mostly because of the transportation problem. So there was only so far that you could bring in goods from faraway places. They didn't have fossil fuel. They didn't have, giant ships in the ocean, those container ships. That didn't exist. So it was pack animals and humans was the only way. So that was going to break. And the other problem, of course, was supply lines and also the communication for the military. They could only get so long before the chain of command would break. So they could only get so far as in terms of, building this sort of mini mega machine at the time. And there have been 34 civilizations around the world. The pattern is exactly the same, no matter what continent you're looking at, and they all end in collapse. And when I say that, what it means is the last proteins in the cooking pots are human, right? It ends with starvation. It ends with, just massive societal breakdown and, people eating their own because that's all you got. So
Lierre, in one of your lectures in Denver, I think it was in Denver, you called this an avalanche of grief. And moving up to today, this phrase touched me when I first heard it, and I'm sure it does to a lot of your other people that you're interacting with and out there. Can you talk a little bit more about how this system now is starting to come about? We're seeing, for example, this breakdown of supply lines. We're seeing fires and storms and so forth, and the young people are saying, well, basically, you see this cry of grief.
I mean, we're right at the edge. In my lifetime, half the mammals have been killed. There's 50% less wildlife than the day I was born. That is kind of a horrifying thought. Somewhere around 90% of either the direct productive capacity of the planet or the indirect capacity of the planet goes to humans or to our livestock and our pets. So all the sunlight that falls on the ground, all of the activity of the bacteria that makes soil, like everything all along that chain, it has all been converted to us. There's no conceivable way this is a plan with a future. Like, we might not have oxygen in 100 years, people. The plankton are collapsing. And not a lot of people care about plankton. They're tiny, they live in the ocean. We don't really see them, but they're responsible for the oxygen in 2 out of 3 animal breaths. We rely on them. I mean, we hear a lot about the rainforest, and that's very true. We all should care very deeply about the rainforest, but the plankton is really 2 out of 3 animal breaths. And they're collapsing right now because the oceans have become so acidified from absorbing all the carbon that we've been burning using fossil fuel. So the oceans have been this great sink for that carbon. And what it means is the plankton populations they can't survive. So everywhere you look in this culture, if you've got your eyes even half open, you will see nothing but death and destruction. And if you have a heart, you will feel that grief. So we're talking about the insect apocalypse. I don't even know how to describe to young people what it was like when I was a child. If you drove in the summer, you had to stop every 15 minutes and scrape dead insects off your car. You remember this, right? It's not true anymore. I remember in 2010, all of a sudden realizing I didn't have to scrape my windshield. And anybody who is younger than that, you've never seen what I'm talking about. They call this shifting baselines, right? What you think is normal, it just keeps moving, right? And the people who weren't there before have no idea how dense the world was with life. And I already, was born on a really, really deficit, of a planet. Like, so much destruction had already been done. And yet even I remember when things were dramatically better, and they just keep getting worse. So somehow we've got to find it in ourselves. I mean, that grief is going to be there, but we have to fight anyway. This is the last moment. It's our last moment. It's all of the feedback loops are getting worse and worse. For instance, every time a little bit of ice melts in Antarctica, what happens is it exposes a little bit of ground, and the ground is dark. What that means is it absorbs even more heat than it would have if it was covered in ice and snow. It would have reflected off. Instead, it absorbs. Now it's even warmer. Now even more melts. Now that patch of ground is even bigger. Now it absorbs even more. So this is a feedback loop, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. Same thing's happening in the rainforest. And some people are saying it's already happened, that the rainforest is now a net carbon, a source of carbon into the atmosphere. It's no longer absorbing because it's been so disrupted. So wherever you look, you're going to see this, whether it's a species that you love, whether it's a piece of ground you love, whether it's a vast thing like a mountain or the sky, it's all being destroyed. And we're either going to face this and turn and fight, or we're all just going to have to accept that it's over. And I'm not willing to accept that, as long as there's one, start crying, as long as there's one tree, I think it's worth fighting. And maybe I read the War Acts a few too many times as a kid, but I still want to fight for that tree.
Yes.
I don't know anyone who wants to go back to where they grew up because it breaks their heart. Where I grew up was at the time meadows and cottonwoods and meadowlarks, and garter snakes and anthills. And when I was in second grade, this is how I became an environmentalist. When I was in second grade, they put in a subdivision. And when my mom was a little girl in the 1930s, she would ride a cow from her house to her grandma's house across the pasture. And I was doing a talk in Nebraska where she grew up. And I went to the house where she grew up, and there are shopping malls. They're the only grass is in a lawn. I mean, there's no meadows. It's inconceivable to have a pasture there. And then we go back 70 more years before that, and my mother's grandmother was born on the sod house on the prairie. And when she was a little girl, when there would be a thunderstorm, she would be afraid that the buffalo were going to stampede and run over their sod house and collapse it, which never happened. But the point is, who today
Has ever even seen
a herd of wild buffalo, much less had been afraid that one was going to run over the house? And it's just this incessant collapse. And
where we live in the Pacific Northwest, there's all these streams, these really amazing, just the waterways here are incredible, but they should be salmon bearing streams. And there's almost none left because all the streams, all the rivers have been dammed, but there's people still alive. It wasn't that long ago. And they remember what it was like when the salmon would come back, and their descriptions are just amazing. Apparently you can hear them.
You could hear them for miles.
You could hear them for 24 hours. They said it sounds like rolling thunder in the distance, and it would just get louder and louder and louder. And then there would just be fish everywhere. And that's what the world should look like. No matter where you turn, you should see that level of abundance.
People in California, if you were next to a river, you would see a grizzly bear every 15 minutes.
And they're huge apex predators. So that's how much food there was, even for a creature as large as a grizzly bear. And there's none left. The only grizzly bear left is the one on the flag. The state of California has a grizzly bear.
Let me ask you quickly, what does it mean to have an area of feeding, and how many bears would you have in a certain area with an apex feeder? What does this mean?
So the apex predators are the ones what they call the trophic pyramid. So energy, accumulates upwards. So the plants accumulate the bottom of it. They're collecting the sunlight. Then you've got creatures like rabbits or deer or, bison who eat the plants. And then you've got another level that eat them. And some wolves, humans, bears, coyotes, anything like, that level. Hawks, absolutely, eagles. So that's the trophic pyramid. So it's just the way that energy condenses up.
Except I don't like pyramid. I never liked it.
Well, it works for energy.
Because the soil goes,
I know.
the soil eats everybody.
I mean, ultimately it's a circle, so it only works if you're talking about the
Right.
condensation of energy. It doesn't work like in any kind of hierarchical way.
Right.
Because ultimately, yes, the soil eats us all. We all get eaten by somebody when we die.
Right.
It's just a question of, is it actively right now? Or
So
is
it kind of gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it goes back to
and it
tiny.
goes back to little again, and then the
And
bacteria
so-
starts over.
Yeah, so the tiny ones eat the big ones, and then the slightly bigger ones eat the tiny ones, and then the slightly bigger ones, and it goes all the way up, and then the tiny ones eat them again.
So for a human in a temperate climate like this, the estimates that I've read, or for a hunter-gatherer type person, it would be about 1 square mile to support an adult. And the reason it's 1 square mile is because you're living in place with the rest of those members of the community. You contrast that to an agriculturalist, to a farmer, and it only takes a few acres to support a human being. That's because you've cleared that land of every living thing. The only person being supported on that land is the one human. Whereas for the hunter-gatherer, all of that life is in place. So you're taking your nutrition from within a living community. You're not imposing yourself across a biotic community, erasing all of that life really into extinction, and then only dedicating that land and that sunlight to humans. So that's the difference, because people are like, oh, you can raise so many more humans. Yeah, you can. A, it's temporary because that soil is going to collapse. But B, what about all the other creatures? You don't have a living planet without all the creatures that do that work for us. We're just the icing on the cake. We don't really provide much for anybody. We do have a role. I mean, apex predators do something, but it's not like what are we? What would you say?
We're just we're the yeast, or we're the eggs, or we're just one ingredient. We're not like the icing, the super sweet.
Well, I wasn't thinking in terms of sweet, just like decorative. So I suppose it depends how because there's like the cake, like that's the thing, right? And then you've got like, all right, we'll make it pretty, but like cake is the thing you need, which yes, needs all the ingredients, and that's really what matters. So that's interesting. We've never had that discussion before. Anyway, so for a grizzly bear, grizzly bears are huge. So I would imagine it would be a bunch more acres, a bunch more square miles for a grizzly bear.
And people know this, but I'm guessing 20 square miles. The thing is, it's also different by place. So you can have a grizzly bear living in
Montana
or in Arizona, who would require a much larger area. And it was the same with humans here. The salmon were so thick that the population of this area pre-conquest was like half of what it is now.
So a lot of people
could live here.
Because there were so many fish, and they came to you. All you had to do was dip your net in, and you had all the food you could ever want. And it was an amazing thing. And it was the same and you can still see in Alaska, they have the webcam, the animal cam that's in, what's the name of that park?
Kenai?
Yeah, and they have the Fat Bear Week, which I think is now. You can go
and they go and scoop them up.
And you can watch them feeding on the salmon streams. It's absolutely extraordinary. But then you get to bet on which is the fattest bear, and it's like the strange food.
Well, and actually, it's an interesting thing too, that the real fattest bears were in Los Angeles, because they did not eat fish; they ate acorns, and there were so many acorns, and also they didn't have to hibernate.
Right, because it's warm.
So they could hang out all winter, and evidently the bears in Los Angeles were absolutely huge.
So you asked about grief, this avalanche of grief, and a moment for me was I had never before in my life tried to look at historical pictures of what we now know as Los Angeles before it was a city, and there actually are some, because of right around that time the camera becomes a thing, and you actually can find old photographs from the year 1900 of the land that is now buried under all that concrete. And I sobbed. I could not believe how beautiful it was. The rivers and the trees. It was like you could just see the density of life, the lushness. And I've only been to Los Angeles once, and it's an absolute horror scene. And it's just gone from just undescribable amount of just heaven to just the worst hell that humans can create. This is what we've done. So
back in 1989 or 1990, I got a wild hare and drove up to the Northwest Territories in Canada. And there was one road that I took. There was hundreds of miles of unbroken forest. And the entire time I kept thinking, this is what it was like everywhere. And it doesn't matter whether you're in Tokyo or Berlin or name some cities, Rio de Janeiro, Mexico City. At one point,
that's what it
was lush. And it's a project I will never get to do because I don't have the capacity, but I would love to see is Farley Mowat did a great book called Sea of Slaughter, in which he just discussed like what the cod banks were like, used contemporary accounts of what the cod banks were like. They were so thick with cod in the North Atlantic that they would actually slow down ships passing. And people would just drop a basket into the water and they would pull it up and it'd be full of fish. And one of the biggest hazards to shipping in the North Atlantic was whales, because there were so many whales that they would bump into your ship and make a hole. And then he talked about the passenger pigeons, so in flocks so large they darkened the sky for days at a time. Flocks of Eskimo curlews almost that big, and both of those are extinct. And I would love to see that for the entire world. He did it for North America. And I would love to know, and I would love for individuals to, wherever you live, to know the ecological history and to know that salmon ran thick up the rivers in Germany and eels ran thick up the rivers of Germany. And I don't know what else. We've pretty much exhausted my knowledge of German ecology, except there were also wild buffalo, there were
The Przewalski's horses.
horses, there were
Wolves,
wild
certainly.
wolves, bears. And, you know, no matter where somebody lives, they're living in a grossly impoverished version of what it was.
We're living in a graveyard, all of us.
It's, you know, even I've lived here for 22 years and protect the land, and the land is reasonably healthy, but even something as simple as banana slugs, I used to see an average day, I would see 20 years ago, I would see 50 banana slugs at the right time of year. And now I was excited yesterday because I saw a banana slug on your porch. And this is what's happening with everything. It's just, it's, you know, and people ask me a lot how I handle the grief. And I always say that I feel it. And I think most of us spend more energy attempting to not feel it than we do just feeling it. And there's a wonderful thing that happens when you allow yourself to feel it, is you realize it doesn't kill you. And I'm a complex enough being that I can hold in my art the understanding that we're really screwed. At the same time, life is really good and worth fighting for. And I can be both sad. I don't take it personally. I'm really sad a lot of the time, but it's not my fault all by myself.
Right.
And so there's this idea that people, unconscious usually, that people feel like they can't acknowledge how bad things are because then that somehow makes them a bad person or something.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, it's just, go ahead.
Well, you can also be really sad. And
Yeah, that's the thing.
I mean, just even in our own personal lives, we know that's true. You know, you go through a breakup or somebody is sick or somebody dies, you know, you're going to have these traumas throughout your life. There's no way around it. But even in those very, very worst times, you still have to get out of bed and feed the dogs and get the kids to school and you pay your mortgage or whatever it is, you know, pay the electric bill. Like life keeps moving. You have to make yourself do it anyway. Even if you're crying the whole time, you still get it done. And I think it's much the same on a larger level. There are, whatever proportion of us understand how bad these things are, we cannot let this grief mobilize us because the world needs us. This is the last moment to fight. And we are going to have to pull ourselves together and get it done, or there'll be nothing left.
Yeah, I have no patience for the people who say, oh, things are so bad, I'm just going to quit. Or
to me, that's just more reason to fight. Like,
yeah,
I'm not giving up. And maybe I'm just a persistent. I have a family member who's British military, and apparently they have this phrase about you're a persistent PLF. And I think I'm just a PLF. Like I'm just not giving up. And maybe that's just my nature. But I encourage everybody to be a PLF for your planet because this is it. We're up against the edge.
And the smartest decision I ever made in my life was when I was maybe 24. I realized everything's messed up and I didn't know what I could do. And the problems are so big. I was just overwhelmed. So I didn't do anything. And then I realized one day I wasn't paying enough for gas. What I meant by that is that at the time, gas was $1 a gallon. And the $1 a gallon that I paid for gas did not cover the social and ecological costs. So what I decided to do is for every $1 I spent on gas, I would give $1 to the local environmental organization. I knew even then that big environmental organizations weren't very good. It needed to be local. But I didn't have any money. So what I did is I paid myself $5 an hour to do activism. And that I could do. And So if I spent $10 on gas that week, that meant I had to do 2 hours of activism. I started out by writing letters to the editor, and I was so scared I wouldn't use my own name. And then after that, I went to doing like anti-circus demos. And I remember I showed up at this anti-circus demo. I just showed up. I didn't have a sign or anything. And the people, they gave me a sign. I'm standing there holding a sign. Circuses are bad. And somebody came up to me really mad and said, "Why are circuses bad?" And I said, "I don't know. Ask the guy next to me." You know, it's like I didn't let my ignorance stop me. I love this line by Florence Nightingale about, "I owe my success to the fact that I never gave nor took an excuse." And I did that with this. If I had to do 2 hours of activism that week, I would do it no matter what. And then in a few months, I was having so much fun with the activism, doing timber sale appeals, doing all sorts of stuff like that, that I could stop keeping track. So the point is, as you say, well, I'll just use this since you're sitting here. The big difference is not between those who.
Yeah, it's not about your sort of your political position in the world. The real difference is between those who do something and those who do nothing. And we really are all called right now to do something. Whatever it is you want to do, your planet is bleeding out, folks.
And no matter what you love, it's under assault. And it doesn't matter. It could be the Franklin's bumblebee. It could be a place. It could be the oceans. It could be women's rights. It could be long form thinking. It could be independent bookstores. Whatever you love, it's under assault. And
it needs you.
It needs you. And I always think, I write. I mean, it's nice when people like my work, but I really write for two groups of people. One is the humans who come after, presuming there are any, and the other is non-humans, presuming they continue to. And so I write for them, and I write to, that's where my work is for. And, whatever you love is under assault. And it's not that complicated, people think, oh gosh, again, I don't know what to do. But if you love someone and you see that someone is being assaulted, you step in. Oh, this isn't a love thing, but it's just an example. I was in a terrible ice storm one time, and my car slid off the road. And then this other car came sliding up, and it wasn't going fast, otherwise I would have jumped out of the way. It was like going a mile an hour. It's just, they can't stop. It's just ice. And so I just jump in between the two cars and push them so it slides by me. And again, I didn't love that truck that much, but the point is, you just do what's necessary. I was taught when I was a kid that if there's a problem, you step in and fix it.
Also, none of us can do this alone. It is a rather overwhelming amount of both grief and rage, I think, can consume your soul pretty quickly. But if you have friends and good people around you, that's a lot less likely to happen, because you can see that there's still good things in the world. And you get that emotional support, that emotional release. It can make all the difference. So don't fight alone.